Morning, 8th graders. Today is April 22nd, 2020. I forget what day we are in our quarantine homeschooling uh, attempt here. Most of you did a good job and took your test, and nobody complained about the format of the test on Otis. Everyone was able to get to Otis as far as I know. I'm still missing about 20 people that haven't taken the test yet, and if that test isn't done soon, the format of that test will change. So if you're one of those people and you haven't taken my test yet, you need to contact me right away, and you need to get that test taken right away, or the format's going to change, and I don't want to have to send emails and contact you every time I have an assignment. So please watch the videos, take the test, do your homework. Today, we're going to start chapter 20, which is industry and immigration. So we've gone through a couple of waves of industry and a couple of waves of immigration in the late 19th century, which is the late 1800s, and the early 1900s are no different. In fact, there's a boom in industrial change, and we're going to take a look at the wheres and the whys and the whos, mostly the whos of that, and we'll compile that with some data from today. So eventually later this week, we'll take a look at what does it look like when we compare big business, industry from the early 20th century or late 19th century, the 1800s and 1900s, to 2020. Big difference, little difference. We're talking about really the first time in history where people make so much money that they have to start giving it away. It's called philanthropy. That's something that's brand new to history. The world had never seen that before, at least on normal people. I mean, kings and queens maybe benevolent enough to give some money away. By the way, I'm doing today's presentation outside, so if you hear birds chirping or Tannen bouncing on the trampoline, just ignore it as best you can. So I'll get started right away. And chapter 20, 21, we're going to lump these two chapters together. We'll take some sort of a quiz or test or assessment together over these two. So when we look at section 1, it says America enters the industrial age. We look at these pictures of these little children working on spindles in a textile mill. Textile mills weren't new, and child labor wasn't new. We're going to see some changes to that. But look at the kids here, 8, 9, 10 years old maybe. No shoes, no protective gear, no safety equipment. Very, very dangerous. But that was the way things were. And in the late 1800s, we see a huge surge in change in how things are produced in America and what types of things are produced. And part of it is in part due to the end of the Civil War and a need for massive change in the way we run our businesses, and also because of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. So just imagine for a minute, if they built all those miles and miles and miles of railroad track, they also have to build locomotives to run on those miles and miles of railroad track and train cars to be pulled behind the locomotives. All of that takes steel. Steel is not cheap, but it was cheaper and more efficient because of a factory called U.S. Steel, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, run by a guy named Andrew Carnegie, who is one of those men that we'll compare with then and now. Factories began to produce it in large quantities because it was needed. So in America, necessity drives invention. When we have a need for something, we create for what is needed. So we needed barbed wire, we needed plows because all those people were moving out onto the plains to homestead. We needed nails to build more houses. America was just exploding, and all of that material was coming from the steel mills. Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York, steel mills in the east coast of the United States. We have Thomas Edison over here messing around with electricity. Now, Edison wasn't the only one messing with electricity. There were others too, but he does invent the light bulb, and they say it took him well over 1,000 attempts to get to the right vacuum tube glass bulb with the right little piece of electric carbon filament electric wire that goes inside of it. The light bulb that Thomas Edison invented was nothing like a light bulb we have today. Many or most of us are probably using either fluorescents or like the fluorescents in the classroom, or the ones that are kind of swirly looking, or even more modern are LEDs, which use just a fraction of the energy and produce very little heat. They're much more efficient to use than anything that Edison would have ever imagined. But imagine going from darkness to light. It changes everything from factory work hours to How do we do things at home? In the old days, it gets dark. You go to bed. There's nothing else to do. Now we can stay up and turn on lights and watch television and all that kind of stuff because of the invention of things that we could use electricity for. How about this? Girl's best friend. Just kidding. Not really. Alexander Bell invents the telephone on March 10th, 1876. In Boston, he called his assistant. He says, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." That's the first telephone call. "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." In another room, but that's the first telephone call, sending a voice message over a wire. No longer clicking out Morse code or Alfred Vail's code, if you remember. There are some disputes as to whether he actually created it. Some people think that a guy I think it was in France, invented something much earlier, but not really sure about that. Bell's invention.
Alexander Graham Bell was a prominent inventor and engineer who is famous for his development of the telephone. Bell was born in 1847 in Edinburgh, Scotland, and showed a natural curiosity at an early age, inventing a wheat husking machine at the age of 12 to help his neighbour's flour milling business. Bell's mother began to go deaf shortly after his 12th birthday, so he helped her to construct a basic finger sign language, and this led to him studying and teaching elocution and speech mechanics at the age of 16 in Scotland. In 1870, Bell and his family emigrated to Canada, and later Bell founded a school in Boston which trained teachers of deaf students. The school was taken up as part of the University of Boston, and Bell became professor of vocal physiology and elocution. In 1874, Bell began experimenting with the phonautograph, which drew the shapes of sound waves based on the vibrations they made. This led to investments from two wealthy patrons who were looking at sending multiple telegraph messages on the same line. This enabled him to develop his acoustic telephone, and he applied for a patent in 1875, which was granted in 1876. This was controversial, as another inventor, Elisha Gray, also developed a telephone prototype at the same time, and the actual inventor of the telephone is still in question, although Bell is credited with the invention. Despite this, the technology developed and Bell demonstrated his invention in 1876, and the Bell Company was founded in 1877, and in under a decade 150,000 people owned telephones. He then founded his Volta laboratory, where he continued his telecommunication experiments and teaching techniques. He also worked on early theories of magnetic recording, the basic theory behind cassette tapes, floppy disks, and hard disks. He also invented the metal detector and was one of the founding members of the National Geographic Society. He considered his invention of the telephone as a blight on his scientific career and actually refused to have a telephone in his own house.
That's kind of similar to if you've ever heard stories about Bill Gates, technology guy, founder of Microsoft. It doesn't allow his own children to have devices. So interesting. Sometimes inventors know best. I guess maybe we should pay attention to what they're doing. I have a couple pictures here. You might have seen one of these, in your grandma's house. This was the phone though. When I was growing up, we had you had to dial the thing, and numbers were long, and it took about as long to dial as most of my conversations. I've never used one of these. It's called a candlestick phone here. An operator would connect lines. In fact, back in the old days, a lot of times rural places, especially, one phone number might connect several houses. So if you can imagine, you pick up the phone, you might be listening in on a conversation your neighbor is having. And that'd be horrifying to think that I'd have to listen to what Nate or Hannah was talking about as I'm listening to the phone. So kind of weird. They're called party lines back in the day. Or when we look at some examples of old school cell phones. This was actually my first cell phone here, this Motorola bag phone. Had a cord on it, but it was totally portable as long as you carried this big bag with you. This is probably the most popular cell phone in history, maybe other than the iPhone, this Nokia. Nokia's kind of gone away as a brand. I'm not sure it even exists. And then, of course, the iPhone that everybody knows. Other good inventions, Elias Howe comes up with a typewriter right after the Civil War. Um, Imagine how much easier it is for us, even using a computer, compared to a typewriter, compared to using typed print, like Benjamin Franklin, the printer, would have used, or I don't know, Elias Howe's sewing machine. I might have one wrong there. I'm not sure he invented both of those. I probably should look that up. Um, but we've talked about that one before. So those inventions are life changers for us. They make things a lot easier based on that. And then we also see the typewriter coming into play. This one's just kind of a goofy one here, but you see the old school. In fact, there's one down here. I wish I could get it to come to the front. I'm not sure how to do it. Here, wait, I'll just do this. Bam. There's one here. It's an electric typewriter, so it plugs in and it clicks away really fast. When I was in ninth grade learning typing, I had to learn on an electric typewriter, and many of your parents may be the same situation. So we had some computers and some typewriters, and we took turns using them. So the only problem with the typewriter, it did have a delete function, which was a piece of paper tape that had like whiteout embedded on it. But every time you hit it, it made some noise like wah wah wah. And we had a rule in typing class that you weren't ever supposed to hit the delete or the backspace key. On a computer, you can't ever hear that. So I always got in trouble. Mrs. Young, my typing teacher, always thought I needed to delete less, I guess. By the way, that's a pretty slick, like a laser keyboard. I don't know if that'll ever be a thing, or some people have used them before, but I've never actually seen one. Sewing machine that could automatically put quilts together. And that leads us into tomorrow's discussion on big business. So, our goal this week is really to get into how our world begins to change as necessity dictates invention, or invention dictates necessity in some instances. So, please, thank you for watching the video. If you watch it all the way through, I really appreciate your work and your effort. I hope you had a good day off today with no assignment, or on Wednesday with no assignment. Um, I will see you in Zoom on Thursday at either 10:30 or 12:30. Have a great day.